Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Karen Yarahimilo. I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations as a co-founder of the Institute of Global Politics. Thank you for joining us for today's Rapid Response webinar. Federal immigration enforcement has moved to the center of national debate in recent weeks. Developments in Minnesota and elsewhere have raised urgent questions about the exercise of state power, the rule of law, and public trust in democratic institutions. Now, these are precisely the kinds of issues that belong at the heart of a public policy school like SIPA. One of IGP's core commitments is to serve as a home for rigorous, nonpartisan analysis of the major forces shaping public life. And we do this by convening scholars and practitioners with diverse perspectives and deep expertise, and by creating space for careful evidence-based discussion, especially when the issues are complex and evolving. Today's Rapid Response webinar reflects that commitment. It also connects directly to IGP's American Democracies Initiative, launched by in the past fall by our colleagues, Alex Hartel-Fernandez. This initiative focused on the institutions, the processes, the policies that sustain and sometimes strain democratic governance in the United States. And in addition to his role at IGP leading this initiative, Alex is the Herbert Lehman Professor here at SIPA, and we are very grateful to him for organizing and moderating today's conversations. We are fortunate to be joined by an outstanding panel of experts whom Alex will introduce shortly. They will be bringing perspectives on immigration law, executive power, law enforcement, and public opinion. So thank you again for being with us. I am very much looking forward to the discussion. And Alex, thank you. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Dean, and thanks so much for your support of conversations like this one at the Institute and at SIPA. So as the Dean mentioned, my name is Alex Hartel-Fernandez, and I have the privilege of helping to lead the American Democracy Initiative here at the Institute, which is convening this webinar. Over the past month, we've seen federal immigration agents kill two American citizens, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, in the streets of Minneapolis as part of a surge into the state. Federal immigration forces have also detained hundreds of others, including citizens and journalists, sometimes using violent force. The Minnesota immigration escalation that we've seen in the past month follows a year of the administration deploying federal law enforcement across a number of cities and states at a scale not previously seen in recent years, and using tactics that many have criticized. Immigration agents are also ignoring rulings by other parts of our political system, most notably our federal judiciary. And a federal judge recently wrote that immigration forces, quote, have likely violated more court orders in the past month than some federal agencies have violated in their entire existence. In response to this escalation and the public debate that it has sparked, we've seen mass mobilization of Americans into the streets protesting the immigration enforcement surge, most recently in the Twin Cities. We've also seen politicians from both parties, including in the White House and Congress, respond to begin budget negotiations over potential limits to immigration enforcement and the surge in recent months. All of these developments, as the Dean mentioned, raise critical and urgent questions that really cut to the heart of our system of governance in the United States. What limits do federal immigration agents have to use violent force, even lethal force, against protesters or U.S. citizens? More broadly, what is the relationship between federal law enforcement, executive power, constitutional constraints, and the powers of cities and states? How much of a break does the current administration's agenda around immigration enforcement represent from past policies and our broader system of criminal justice and law enforcement? And in what ways is the administration succeeding in reshaping law enforcement through the immigration system and beyond? How are immigration advocates and communities of immigrants responding? And how has the American public responded in its views towards immigrants, law enforcement, and the Trump administration? These are critical questions, and to answer them, we're really fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts to bring their research and expertise to this discussion. I'm going to introduce them briefly in turn, and we're going to have a series of directed questions to each of them, and we're going to then open it up to questions from you all. And thank you again for joining the conversation this morning. I encourage you to submit the questions that you might have as we start the conversation using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. We'll be taking those in the second half of the discussion and directing them to the panelists. To answer these questions and for our discussion today, we're fortunate to have Elora Mukherjee, who is the Jerome L. Greene Clinical Professor of Law here at Columbia University. And she's a globally recognized advocate, practitioner, and voice for immigrants, asylum seekers, and unaccompanied migrant children. She's also the director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic at Columbia Law School. G. Elliott Morris is a data-driven journalist and author of the book Strength in Numbers and a Substack of the same name that uses original surveys, data analysis of public opinion to inform transparent, data-driven commentary on what Americans think about politics. Ilan Wurman is the Julius E. Davis Professor of Law at the University of Minnesota, where he teaches administrative law and constitutional law, writing on the 14th Amendment, administrative law, separation of powers, and constitutionalism. And last, we have Marie Gottschalk, who's the Edmund J. Kahn Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, where she specializes in American politics. She's the author, most recently, of the book Crime and No Punishment: Wealth, Power, and Violence in America. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here this morning. And let's start things off, Elora, with a question for you. We've all seen the images and video footage out of Minnesota over the past weeks, showing immigration officials using violent force on immigrant families, children, and sometimes U.S. citizens who are protesting the immigration actions. Stepping back, how has immigration enforcement under the Trump-Vance administration changed? What are the ways that it represents a break from past policies, and what are the ways in which there's a continuity of policies? And how are these changes being felt by immigrant communities, including both legal and undocumented communities?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for those questions. There has been a sea change in immigration enforcement in the United States over the past year, and it has caused terrifying effects on immigrant communities and communities of color more generally in the United States. I could talk about these changes all day, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to highlight 7 changes that are very important for the public to understand. First, the administration is claiming that mandatory detention applies to large swaths of non-citizens in a way that mandatory detention has never been claimed by the executive branch before. So the Trump administration is claiming that it has the authority to mandatorily detain law-abiding non-citizens who've been living in the United States for decades, adults and children alike. This claim has been rejected by many hundreds of federal court decisions. According to a Politico analysis from earlier this month, that claim has been rejected by more than 1,600 federal district court and federal appellate court decisions. And while the Trump administration is subjecting tens of thousands of people to detention, those detention conditions are terrible. They're degrading, they're appalling, they're inhumane. And currently there are about 70,000 people in immigration detention facilities, which is a far higher number than we have seen in US history. Second, now, unlike in previous decades, immigration enforcement can occur anywhere. Previously, there was a memo in place called the ICE Sensitive Locations Memo, which generally prohibited, absent exigent circumstances, immigration enforcement from taking place in schools, in hospitals, in houses of worship, at places of public protest, in recognition that people, regardless of their immigration status, should be able to go to these places without fear. The Trump administration rescinded that memo on January 20th of last year, and we are seeing the consequences. Immigration enforcement is now taking place anywhere and everywhere. Third, this administration has stripped people who previously had lawful status of their legal protections. We've seen this in the context of people having their temporary protected status being terminated or rescinded, which has affected hundreds of thousands of people and put them at risk of deportation. Similarly, we've seen the administration terminate parole status that tens of thousands of people had, thereby also making them at risk of being subject to deportation. There's also an increased effort by the administration to denaturalize US citizens. Next, I want to talk about the indefinite pause on asylum applications. All affirmative asylum applications before an agency called US Citizenship and Immigration Services are now on hold, pending what's called a comprehensive review. We don't know how long that review will take, but in the meantime, the lives of many tens of thousands of people, potentially more than 1 million people, are indefinitely on hold while their applications are in limbo. There has also been a firing of immigration judges. Over the past year, we have seen more than 100 immigration judges being fired across the country in a politicized effort that has never before been undertaken at this scale by the executive branch. Then there is an agency called the Board of Immigration Appeals, and over the past year, the Board of Immigration Appeals has narrowed the eligibility of immigrants to have legal status and to seek legal protections in the United States. And the final change I'll mention is about third country deportations. This executive branch is trying to deport people to countries that they have no ties to, such as South Sudan and Eswatini, in a way that potentially contravenes US obligations under both the Refugee Act of 1980, which is domestic law, as well as the United Nations Refugee Convention.
Thanks for laying that out and zooming out to really think about the entire system of immigration enforcement and how it's changing, Elora. A follow-up question for you. How are immigrant communities and civil society responding to this expansion of immigration enforcement and the changes that you've laid out?
Civil society and immigrant communities have shown remarkable resilience in the face of a violent and lethal crackdown on immigrant communities. And we're seeing this throughout the country, and especially now in Minnesota, as community members are looking out for one another. They are helping to deliver food to people who are too scared to leave their homes. They're helping to take children to school when parents and other caregivers are afraid to do so. People are setting up ICE watches in their neighborhoods, alerting their neighbors and their friends when ICE is coming through. And critically, people are filming and documenting ICE encounters so that the truth is made public. We're seeing an executive branch that repeatedly tries to recast what ICE agents and other federal immigration officers are doing as lawful, as humane, when in fact that is not what is happening in many encounters. Now, the organizing by people on the ground is amazing, and that is paired with legal efforts in courts across the country, both at the individual level through legal mechanisms such as federal habeas petitions and through class actions such as the effort to stop the executive branch from reinterpreting the 14th Amendment's protection for birthright citizenship. Lawyers, immigration lawyers, are literally working nonstop with civil rights lawyers and others to try and push back against the worst abuses of the executive branch. And lower federal courts, especially federal district courts, have been important bulwarks against the worst abuses of the executive branch. But once cases get to the Supreme Court, unfortunately, in the immigration space, we've seen over and over that the Supreme Court is effectively a rubber stamp for the executive branch's worst abuses. What this means is that we cannot trust the courts to save us in this moment. It needs to be we, the people, who are stepping out, who are protesting, who are looking out for our neighbors, and who are going to vote in both the midterms and the next presidential election to really influence the future of what our nation is, both in terms of immigration enforcement and in terms of many other critical issues.
Thanks, Elora. Ilan, I'd like to turn to you and talk a little bit about the legal challenges against the administration's immigration ramp up, particularly in Minnesota, but more generally as well. Critics are arguing that they are breaking the law, and the administration argues that they're acting within the authorities that they have around immigration enforcement. Could you tell us a little bit more about what this debate looks like?
Yeah, so the debate really centered on this lawsuit that was filed by Minnesota against the federal government, accusing the federal government or alleging that the federal government was violating state sovereignty. And actually, not surprisingly, the federal district judge who was appointed by President Biden recently rejected that claim. Because, this is a complicated issue, and there are a couple things to talk about here. The first is, I don't think anybody really doubts that federal law is supreme within its sphere, right? States have a residuum of sovereignty, but within the federal government sphere, it is supreme. I don't think anybody doubts that immigration is within federal power, although when you really look at the Constitution, there's no immigration power in Article 1, Section 8, so you have to kind of derive it from other things, which is an interesting debate, but most people accept that the federal government has this power. And so the federal government has the right, as long as the statutes authorize sufficient number of officers, and there aren't other prohibitions in statutes, right, to send federal officers to execute the law, right? The president has this duty of faithful execution. But what is the relation to state officers is really the question here. And I don't think anybody doubts that the federal government cannot commandeer state officers. It can't co-opt state officers to help enforce the law. This is called the anti-commandeering doctrine. And this is where we kind of get this sanctuary city policy issue, right? So if the federal government comes and asks, can you hold on to somebody who's here unlawfully and who's in your jail? I guess there's some other crime has also been committed so that we can come and enforce the law. Is that commandeering? Well, it's actually tricky. On the one hand, it's like saying, can we come enforce the law? But on the other hand, if you hold somebody even 5 minutes longer than you otherwise would, aren't you enforcing federal law for those 5 minutes, right? So there's this tricky question. But the point that I want to make most sort of earnestly is that when you look at history, it was the anti-federalists. It was those distrustful of central government power who wanted state officers to assist in the enforcement and execution of federal law because they distrusted what they would often call a swarm of harpies, a swarm of federal officers who came from out of state to enforce the law. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, it alleges that King George III has sent a swarm of British officers to harass the people and eat their substance. And so the anti-federalists wanted state officers to help assist in the execution of federal law because they would be closer to the people. They would be closer to, they would understand the community. They'd be elected by the community. But this requires cooperation, right? If they don't enforce federal law, then the federal government has this right to send in these officers. And so the sanctuary city policies, in some respect, might get this valence a little bit backward, right? If you want to interpose between the federal government and the people, you want state officers to assist in that task who can mitigate the rigors of federal law enforcement. And interestingly, the Biden appointed judge said almost as much as that in her ruling, saying that one could argue that it's the sanctuary city policies that is the reason for this federal sort of this federal surge in law enforcement. And so she rejected the claims partly on those grounds. And so there's a lot that both sides can do to turn the temperature down and to start cooperating more. But I do think to say that this is just the fault of the federal government is overstated.
Thanks, Ilan. And following up on that relationship between the states and the federal government, many Americans have been calling on Minnesota officials to independently investigate the shooting deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, given this ramped up immigration enforcement. What powers do states or localities have to be able to conduct that kind of investigation? And how much do states and localities need to rely on the federal government for those investigations?
That is an excellent question, and there are two ways one could answer this. One could answer it under the original meaning of the Constitution, and then there's the subsequent doctrine. And I think the subsequent doctrine is quite inconsistent with the original meaning of the Constitution. I think under the original meaning, federal officers, just like British officers in colonial times, were subject to state common law prosecutions for things like unlawful trespass. If you have a warrant, the warrant might insulate the officer from that trespass. But if you don't have a warrant, for example, or if the warrant was facially invalid, you would still be liable, even if you were instructed, right, by the President of the United States to do something, right? There's this famous case, Little against Barem, where the law of Congress authorized the seizure of French ships, or of ships heading to French ports, but John Adams ordered the captain to seize a ship coming from a French port, and the captain was held personally liable for the seizure, notwithstanding the president's order, because it was contrary to the statute, right? And so historically, federal officers would be subject to liability. But so much has happened since then, including the emergence of various immunity doctrines, which make it exceedingly difficult for state officers to prosecute federal officials, because as long as it's shown under the modern doctrine that they were acting within the scope of their duties, it could become very difficult. But of course, the presumption is if you've done something unlawful that's outside the scope of your duty, at least as a historical matter, but there are so many immunity doctrines, qualified immunity, immunity from the Supremacy Clause, that have emerged since then, that it is difficult, which is all the more reason that the federal and state government should cooperate in these kinds of things, because the law is so murky here, that there should be cooperation. Otherwise, both can take a very hard line here, and I don't think that's a great idea.
Thanks, Ilan. And Marie, moving to you, I think among many folks, at least before the ramp up of immigration enforcement under the Trump administration, immigration enforcement was seen as being a separate part of the criminal justice system. But your new book really urges us to think about these institutions as deeply intertwined and evolving together. How should we be thinking about the role of the current ramp up in immigration enforcement within the broader history of the criminal justice system in the United States?
Yeah, the broader history is very, very important. For the last 15 years, mass incarceration has emerged as a major issue in the United States, but hiding in plain sight has been this immigration crisis that's been going on in the United States. And it's only now, I think, that the wider public is beginning to realize how deeply entangled these are, not only law enforcement, immigration enforcement, but increasingly the use of the military in the United States. ICE, created in 2003, 2004 with the Department of Homeland Security, its budget has increased about 5 times since then, and about 3 times just over the last year. What we also have seen is that DOJ resources going back to the 80s have changed remarkably. So in the 80s and the early aughts, the 90s, about 10 to 20% of prosecutions were prosecutions for immigration enforcement issues. Now it's over 50%. And so what we're seeing is a decline in prosecutions for corporate crime, major sex trafficking, drug trafficking crimes, things like that. We have people, FBI agents with the crackdown in Washington, D.C., who are experts on these task forces for corporate crime. They're not doing their day job. They're out on the street doing immigration enforcement. But I think it's really important to think pre-ICE age, that these things have been deeply enmeshed and deeply entangled in American history, and that the signature tough on crime bills from the Clinton administration and the Reagan administration, we focus on how they criminalize many drug crimes more intensely, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes and you're out. But these also included the kind of major weapons now that the government is using to deport people, to deport them for minor infractions, for crimes from many, many years ago. And they've also taken what was administrative civil crimes and transformed them into criminal enforcement. We also see capacity matters. So jail, we're focusing on ICE's building out. But jails, for the last century, we've had 3,000 jails, and most of the people are initially going to be held in jail or transferred out of jail or detained in a jail. And that jail space provides a lot of flexible space. You can use it for criminal violations, you can use it for immigrant violations, and jails have been increasing their has been a major economic development particularly for rural and poor areas in the United States. And the other 2 points I want to make is that we can focus on how these systems are coming together in terms of numbers, but I think it's really important to focus on the conditions of confinement. As Elora said, migrants serve their time in terrible conditions, so do people in jail. And migrants and other people in jail are overlapping now. And jails are one of the worst places to serve your time in the United States. During the Obama administration, there were some detention rules that were put into effect, some standards, and now there's a lot of pushback to get rid of those standards or not even to enforce them. Sheriffs in Florida are saying that the standards are woke and we don't want to enforce them. And the fourth point about immigration is there's a long history of what we might call weaponization of remoteness. When there are protests, when there are hunger strikes, when there's a lot of political attention somewhere, we move people somewhere else and get them away again towards remote areas, rural areas in the United States, so there's less attention to it.
Thanks for that historical context and bringing it back to the present. I'd be curious how you're thinking about the infusion of new budget resources that ICE has received most recently under the budget deal that was passed last year. How do you see those resources and more generally the Trump administration's approach to immigration enforcement as durably changing the contours of immigration enforcement in the criminal justice system?
Well, the one big beautiful bill is staked at about 100,000 ICE detention beds. ICE detention numbers can often be very misleading because people are held in many other situations. They're held by the Marshal Service, they're held in local jails. Certain states like Florida and Texas are holding people for the government very willingly in Alligator Alcatraz. So the actual capacity is often more than that. So figures, sometimes we think it's about 45% more, right? So that number that we heard earlier, about 73,000, 80,000, we got to figure there are probably tens of thousands more being held. The second point is we focus on ICE, but we need to think about the Marshal Service, that the Marshal Service is becoming much more active in this, and that even sanctuary cities, and I don't want to go into all the legal aspects of this, but basically sanctuary cities are protected in some ways, but in other ways, if they have contracts with the Marshal Service, there's a kind of loophole that may force them to hold people. The third thing to think about is we have a lot of capacity. And people say they can't possibly deport millions of people. But during Operation Wetback, during the Eisenhower administration, 800,000 people estimated were deported, and the capacity for the federal government was much, much less than it was there. And the final point, I think, is to look at the tensions that are being created in law enforcement right now, that police and jails were already having trouble recruiting local police and guards. Now they have to compete with ICE, giving much more money, $50,000 bonuses, shortened training, more permissive use of force policies possibly. So there's that tension. And then going back to what Ilan said, is that we now have this tension between different law enforcement groups, police, National Guard, ICE, Border Patrol, and that is creating some new interesting politics, as well as the sheriffs who control 85% of the jails and where many immigrants or migrants are detained.
That's really helpful to understand the broader set of agencies and actors that are involved in this. Elliott, I'd like to turn to you to hear a little bit more about public opinion towards immigration and immigration enforcement. You've been studying public opinion towards Donald Trump now for a while, as well as immigration enforcement. How are Americans thinking about immigration policy, and how has it changed? We heard a lot about immigrant attitudes towards immigration and immigrants driving vote choices in the 2024 elections. How has that shifted now that the administration is a year in and has been ramping up its immigration enforcement agenda?
Yeah, I think the data show a complete sea change, to use the words that have been used elsewhere here, in how voters are thinking about immigration and the sort of pictures that they have in their heads, to steal something from Walter Lippmann, about what immigration policy actually looks like on the ground. And there's a couple of ways that we can explore that. First, while I am a student of public opinion and can't deny the role that media plays in shaping attitudes, in this case, I think media also reflects some changing attitudes and how people are thinking about immigration. And there's some heuristics we can use for that. If you think about the images that were shown on television for immigration policy in the 2024 election, things that come to mind are, Fox News showing live video of migrants under underpasses in South Texas, where I'm from. There's coverage of fences being built in El Paso to combat, alleged surges of migrants crossing the border illegally there. It's just somewhat dubious claims all along. And generally, the images are from right-leaning news networks about a attack on the border, let's call it. Those images that we are seeing now are fundamentally different. They're different in two ways. First, they're coming from left-leaning, mostly networks, things like MS Now, formerly MSNBC, and CNN, which is more centrist, but left-leaning, allegedly. And the images are also different. They're images of law enforcement officers of various training levels, patrolling the streets in America, ramming cars and kidnapping people from their cars, killing people, American citizens in this case, in their cars and on the street. Those images are very different, and we should expect them to change how people are thinking about immigration and deportation. Now, again, I'm a data guy, so let's move away from some of the anecdotes here. There's a couple of ways we can see these impacts, I think, in the real world. The first is if we ask people from, and I'm putting on my pollster hat here, how do you approve of Donald Trump's handling of immigration? You will get one number that might encapsulate a lot of these images and border politics, border security writ large. But if you also ask them, how do you feel about Trump's handling of deportations, you will get separate trends. These trends are diverging significantly at this point, hinting that there's, or in my case, proving that there's a pretty large difference in how people feel about deportations and immigration and border security as three separate issues. We as the partnership I have with the polling firm Verify on my Substack, asking people how they felt about deportations and immigration separately last February, because we anticipated this change in how people are viewing deportations. Right now, Donald Trump's underwater on deportations by about 20 points, and immigration is about 10 points. So if our theory is people are responding to these different images in a negative way, and I think we have some evidence of that. And some other evidence might be triangulating changing images in the media with these changes in public opinion, trying to assess some level of causality. If you do that, then I think there's two obvious tipping points, and this requires some quantitative and qualitative analysis. The first would be the detaining and deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia last April, I believe, February to April, or March to April. Supreme Court case was in April. And public opinion about deportations, as I just mentioned, about immigration, and about the groups of people that the average American wanted deported, changed significantly after the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case. So recall, he's a legal resident of Maryland. The surveys that we've conducted, that other people have conducted, showed that there was never significant support for deporting people like Kilmar Abrego Garcia from America. Donald Trump ran on a platform in 2024, as you raised, Alex, of deporting criminals, violent criminals mainly. This was the rhetoric he used to shore up support for his agenda. People like Kilmar Abrego Garcia are not the types of people Trump said he would deport, and that changes public opinion about his deportation program overall. So if you look at Ipsos's polling about whether or not people are satisfied with the direction that immigration policy is taking, there's a notable shift directly after the Kilmar Abrego Garcia incident. And I think this is a case where the pictures in people's heads are changing and they're reacting to that. The second obvious tipping point is what's happened in Minneapolis over the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, the killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy being the sort of climax points of that series of events. There has been a change in public opinion. There's been a change in ratings of ICE as an agency. There's also been a change in politics that's evidence of that. So this seems somewhat undisputable at this point. 2 weeks ago, maybe you get out over your skis and calling this a tipping point. Now I think this is somewhat self-evident. So some examples of this include DHS is pulling out allegedly of Maine in response to pleas from Senator Susan Collins, who has a potentially rough road to re-election this year. We can think that if public opinion is turning negative in her state, she has some leverage to push DHS out of her state so that Republicans can hold on to their Senate majority. And there's obviously a shuffling of ICE agency heads in Minneapolis, probably not to change the policy on the ground, but to change the perception of it. So Greg Bobina leaves and Homan is put in charge there. So there's some reaction to this that I think proves that we are in a different moment now, and that if you look at the evidence, I think that is because of these changing pictures that people are responding to in the media and social media as well.
Thanks, Elliott. And following up on that, I get two related questions. One, when you look at that sea change that you described in public views about immigration enforcement, are there particular subgroups of demographics that are driving that, or is it across the board? And then are these changing views towards immigration enforcement changing people's approval or disapproval of the Trump administration in general?
In terms of the groups, I'll highlight three. First is independents. In the beginning of Trump's term, independents are opposed to his presidency. They say they disapprove rather than approve at a margin of about 10 points. So they're slightly against him. That, of course, is already a pretty big change from the 2024 election when independents voted slightly for the president. So there's something that goes on between November of 2024 and him starting that changes how voters are thinking about his presidency. Obviously, a choice between candidates is different than a verdict on a presidency, so I think that's a good explanation here. But at this point in his presidency, independent voters are at -40. So that's 60% say they disapprove of the job Trump is doing as president overall, and 20% say they approve of it. That's a all-time low for Trump, not just in his second term, but throughout his first term as well, according to the pollster YouGov. I like to keep these comparisons within pollster because they're apples to apples. His record low in his first term was -25 for context. So this is a pretty significant shift among the swing demographic in America rendering this verdict that they don't approve of the deportation policy or the other aspects of Trump's approval as well. And I'll get to your causation question next. The second group that we should monitor, or that we should mention after monitoring, is Hispanic voters. And here we can rely on some actual election results. We don't just need polling. So in the 2025 governor's race in New Jersey, the Hispanic heavy city, Union City in the north, terrible at cardinal directions, northeast of the state, voted for the Democratic candidate for governor by 70 percentage points, which is a 50 percentage point swing. I know these numbers are just numbers, but a 50 percentage point swing from 2024, the 2024 presidential election. So, and those swings were larger in Hispanic heavy areas of the state than they were in other wider areas of New Jersey. So there's some evidence here that Hispanic voters are reacting more negatively to the Trump administration than other groups. Third, and I think this goes to the case of sort of how severe this policy is, there has been a notable decline in support for the president's agenda among Republican voters. According to the Pew Research Center, last February, 67% of Republicans said they supported most or all of Donald Trump's policies, and that number is down to 56% today. So there's just bare support for, quote, most or all of his policies among his own party. That's significant erosion because that's the group that you would expect is primed to support most of what the president does. I don't know a comparable number for Joe Biden, but here I think the relevant point is not comparative evidence, but the trend. So in terms of causation, right, we have to, I guess we have to be careful in ascribing too much of this to immigration, but this is just a case where you can't deny the evidence in front of your eyes. There's some quantitative evidence that we can rely on to say that Trump's immigration policy has moved voters against him overall. However, that evidence is as follows. First, I ran a survey experiment in my survey last May. This experiment consisted of two questions. First, for one group, we asked voters how they felt This was directly after the Kilmar Vega Garcia incident. Told them what happened to Kilmar Vega Garcia and asked them what happened. And then we asked voters their support for deporting, quote, all undocumented immigrants in America. The group that got the deport all immigrants question first, before having any information about Kilmar Vega Garcia, said they supported deporting all undocumented immigrants in America by 16 percentage points. So it's pretty large net support for what we can call mass deportations. So that's potentially worrisome. But in the group that got the information and question about Kilmar Vega Garcia afterward, that are primed to think about deportations and sort of excesses of Trump's immigration policy, they opposed mass deportations by 4 percentage points. So we see a 20 percentage point shift just in offering this information, this priming information about Trump's deportation policy. So that is pseudo-causal. It's just experimental. I know some social scientists would not call that causal, but I think that points in the same direction as the observational evidence as well. So second observational evidence. In 2025, there was a clear observational relationship between media attention to Kilmar Vega Garcia's deportation and Trump's approval rating overall. So I wrote analysis over this using media headlines from online news aggregators and Google search traffic for deportations and just mentions of Kilmar Vega Garcia and Trump's deportation agenda, and his approval rating both overall and on immigration. And if you compare media attention, number of headlines or percent of all media headlines that are about immigration to other stories of the Trump administration like tariffs or affordability, maybe, there's a much stronger relationship between the increase in attention to immigration and the decrease in Trump's approval rating than there is on any other issue. So that would point as well to there being a significant role for immigration and changing how voters are thinking about Trump's presidency and sort of Trump as a figure overall.
Got it. Thanks for sharing that great summary, both of your work and other research as well. So now I'd love to switch to some of the questions that we're getting from the audience, including some of the questions that were submitted in advance of the event. Let me throw out a couple and feel free to jump in on any of these. The first question is a pre-submitted one and asks, now that we're experiencing this ramp up of immigration enforcement, is it appropriate to look back at the post 9/11 consolidation of the Department of Homeland Security? And should we view that as a mistake? And does Congress need to overhaul the Department of Homeland Security as a result of what we're seeing now? The second question is, how should we think about the durability of what the Trump administration is trying to do? On the one hand, as we've heard from Marie, there's been a ramp up in resources to immigration enforcement. On the other hand, we are seeing this public backlash, as Elliott described, and we're seeing the contours potentially of a deal in Congress that would rein in some of what ICE is and immigration enforcement agents are trying to do. So how should we think about the durability of all of this, recognizing that we're still in the middle of these developments? And last, one of our pre-submitted questions asks about the Insurrection Act, which is something that the Trump administration has threatened to invoke, and what actions could trigger that, what would that mean, and would there be opportunities to push back on that? So 3 big questions, but I'll throw it all to you all to see how you'd like to answer those.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. After the George Floyd protests, there were all these hopes that Washington was going to solve it. And essentially, all those initiatives died in Washington, and also the local and state mobilization died. And I think given the contours in Washington now, it's important to think about DHS. It's important to think about restructuring it at some point. But I also think all the attention on restructuring DHS is going to sap the political energy that's on the ground now to challenge things. And I'm thinking of prosecutors who are getting together now in their own fight against the federal overreach, right? Their own FAFO, right? And there are these kinds of initiatives. And so I would hesitate to say, let's just go focus on redoing DHS. That's a long-term strategy. But right now, I think a lot of the action is going to be in negotiating these local, state, federal relationships in law enforcement and immigration enforcement.
I can build on where Marie left off. So I agree that there is so much that needs to happen at the local and state levels and that we can't leave this to Congress alone. Of course, I support the restructuring of DHS and moving agencies that before September 11th, 2001 were within the Department of Justice back to the Department of Justice, such as what was then called the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which has evolved into U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That agency should definitely be brought back to DOJ. But relying on federal officers alone, people in Congress alone, isn't going to solve the problem. We need local organizing, we need state organizing to build mechanisms of accountability against the federal government, and we need local and state governments as well as ordinary people across party lines to stand up repeatedly every day to resist the worst abuses of the executive branch.
I'm happy to jump in on the Insurrection Act if and defer to Elora when she gets her internet back, if that's okay. I do think the second question and the Insurrection Act question are actually somewhat related. So there's no question that Trump, as a statutory matter, would probably be allowed to invoke the Insurrection Act. But if you just listen to what Elliott just said, I hope that Elliott, you should go give a presentation to the White House. You know, if this is the kind of reaction that exists from simply sending more federal ICE officers and CBP officers, what will the reaction be, you know, to organizing the militia or the National Guard, which is the organized militia, or the Army? So I just don't think it's practical. And Trump has shown good sense, and for that reason, in not invoking the Insurrection Act, even if he might be within his rights. Because, so let me just, on the constitutional question, you know, Congress can provide for calling forth the militia, not just to suppress insurrection, but also to execute the laws of the Union. And although it's called the Insurrection Act, it stems from a 1792 statute, which was just the Militia Act, which says here are the conditions under which you can deploy the militia, the armed body of the people, or the army subsequently, to do these three things, right? And repel invasion, suppress insurrection, or execute the laws. And the requirement is simply that that it be impracticable to execute the laws by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. Now, we could disagree about whether that's true. You know, if state officers are not policing the protests so that you don't get arrests, so you don't even get to judicial proceedings, you know, so the president would probably get deference, white deference, in invoking this. But he, I think, and other people understand that it's sort of a last resort, because there's the Posse Comitatus Act, which isn't in the Constitution, but it is probably as close to a constitutional statute. It has a constitutional aura to it. If you understand sort of the difference, it's not in the Constitution, but people understand that there's this sort of small c constitutional principle that we shouldn't use the Army for domestic law enforcement purposes. And so, you know, you could invoke it. He might be within his statutory rights to do it, but I think there would be a lot of pushback for that reason. Now, this does relate to the second question, right? Is this enduring? Well, you could see from the perspective of the administration why it's probably frustrating to them, because if the only question, if you're of the view that we should remove undocumented immigrants from the country, then simply securing the border, as he has done, doesn't solve the problem, right? Because, you know, every 4 years, 8 years, you might get another influx. And so if you could only stop new ones from coming but not removing, right? But it's obvious that so it would be like this one-way ratchet. But it's obvious that this is not working, right? At the end of the day, you have to be attuned to the sentiments of the people, right? And so are there other possibilities? I don't know where, you know, like the public charge rule is currently. I don't know if it's in the courts or if they tried to resurrect that. You know, it used to be that employers were there were more pressure on them. So it is odd to me that the focus is on this enforcement, you know, rather than, you know, incentive structures or something like that. But like, I don't know. I don't know what the administration is thinking. So I'll stop there on the second and third questions.
These are presidential debate rules, I assume. So I was invoked, so I get to respond. Yeah, look, I mean, Donald Trump has very few incentives to react to public opinion by himself, right? I mean, obviously he wants to avoid some sort of insurrection, if you think of the worst case scenario, against his presidency or any sort of mass scale riots. If you assume he has some sort of normative bent toward law and order. But there's a branch of the federal government that is very responsive to public opinion. That is, of course, Congress. And Republicans in Congress, I would say, have all the incentive in the world, the ones in close seats, as we get closer to November, to react more toward public backlash to the immigration, to the administration's immigration agenda, deportation agenda in particular. So, if you could ask two questions here, where would we see the movement from leaders? So we would probably see it among Republican senators. Collins and Murkowski have been some early voices of dissent for the administration's immigration policy. It looks like Tillis, early on in the post-Preddy world, had some reservations. Maybe they're not enough to vote against ICE funding, however, so that's somewhat debatable what utility there is in Tillis. But the second question might be, as a concerned citizen, where do you direct your efforts? And you direct them toward those senators and towards vulnerable House members as well. Democrats are, at least in our modeling, probably favored to win around 230 House seats in November. Of course, it doesn't just happen. The organizing has to make it happen. But there's 20 years where public backlash could tip the scales, and so focused public efforts at communicating to those vulnerable senators and House members is probably of a lot of utility. But I guess thirdly, to go back to it, if the question is, does Donald Trump just naturally respond to public outcry in Minneapolis, or on the other hand, does he view it as a continued threat to his administration's enforcement of white identity on American politics? Then it's probably not. There might not be a whole lot of utility in trying to convince him directly.
Elliot, let me push back on that a little bit. I feel like we're talking about as if we're in the 2018 midterm elections, or maybe the 2022 midterm elections. And there's a lot of messaging out there that we may not have normal midterm elections. And I think it's very interesting what happened in Fulton County this week with investigations still of 2020 and confiscating voting machines and things like that. So yes, you're responsive, but if the messaging is from a lot of people, it's not democracy anymore, or some people in the administration have outwardly said, we don't know that we need democracy anymore. So there's a real question of how responsive you're going to be. And I think the second point I'd like to push here is, what does reform look like and what does change look like? And I'm influenced here by my work on mass incarceration, that if you get rid of capital punishment in a case and you give somebody a 30-year sentence, that looks like a really great deal. But that's a de facto life sentence, and most other countries don't do that. And so if we get to the point of saying, okay, let's make ICE take their masks off and let's stop executing citizens in the street and let's have them smile a little more, but we still carry on the same policies that we've been doing. Our idea of how things have gotten so extreme that things that pull back a little, that in another day we would think are very extreme measures, we may not think are extreme measures anymore. So I want to just push back on both of those things.
Got it. Thanks, Marie, and thank you for raising the question of what context we're in. I see, Elora, you have rejoined, and hopefully we're able to hear you. If you're able to jump in, I wanted to give you the opportunity to finish your thought on the question of the durability of the Trump administration's reforms and what it means that we're seeing this period of backlash now. Sounds like we may not, unfortunately, have Elora back quite yet, but I do have another question, which builds on a theme that I think has been emerging from the conversation, which is around what role for cooperation between the federal government and the states around immigration enforcement, and more generally. There's a question here in the chat that asks if the states should be cooperating with the federal government, does this not create a moral hazard in which the federal government is incentivized to abuse states in order to extort the states into participating in actions that they do not support? For instance, they give the example, if Minnesota acquiesces to the Trump administration's demands, wouldn't this lead the federal government to continue trying to use this tactic in other states? And maybe we could layer on this the question of whether or not the Trump administration has been targeting political opponents, as it's talked about, in deciding where to send these surges of immigration enforcement. Would be curious, both Ilan and Marie, since you brought up this question of federalism and what the relationship should be, how we should think about this moral hazard that the federal government might face.
Yeah, I'll start. That's a really great question, and the incentives go in two different kinds of ways here, right? I mean, it's like saying when South Carolina announced the nullification of the tariffs in 1828 and 1832, was the Force Act an improper response, right? If they hadn't enacted the Force Act, and that would incentivize the nullification of federal law. Now, maybe that's not what's happening here, right? Maybe the surge, the deployment, I mean, it's been a sanctuary state here. It's been a sanctuary cities where I am, at least, for quite a while. So there isn't that cause and effect. It's not just because, of the sanctuary policies. Maybe there is something else going down, motivating them here. But the incentives, of course, go both ways. And there are states that are cooperating and where you don't see this kind of surge in enforcement. So the truth is that there are lots of inputs here and lots of potential incentives and lots of potential moral hazards in many different directions.
I think with the Trump administration, many states, many universities, many individuals think you can lie low, be below the radar, and it won't hit you. And I think many people are coming around, many states are coming around. I think my city of Philadelphia is coming around to, you need to be prepared, whatever the incentives are, whatever the administration says, that it may come down on you. And as for enforcing the law, I would guess that this week, all of us broke the law in some way. The law is highly discretionary, whether you drive, whether you jaywalk, all kinds of things that you do. And law enforcement is about using your discretion and not, quote unquote, enforcing every law all the time. And it's very interesting that we have many, many more places in the country that say they are sanctuary counties and that they're not going to enforce gun control laws. And yet we don't see the outrage in New Mexico where, dozens of sheriff's counties have said they're not going to enforce gun control. So when we say sanctuary, that they're breaking the law, we look the other way on law all the time. It's a political thing, what laws we enforce, which ones we don't, and it's an institutional capacity issue as well.
Got it. We just have a couple more minutes left, and I wonder, as we close this out, Elliott, Marie, and Ilan, is there one thing that you're looking out for over the next couple of weeks to see how this escalation of immigration enforcement, the backlash that we're seeing in civil society, and potentially in Congress is going to play out? What would you advise our audience to keep their eye out for?
I would say with so many things in the current moment, whether it's in our personal lives, whether it's in studying politics, is to be able to have humility to embrace uncertainty and to be prepared for it, and to look at what happened in Minneapolis and think it could happen here, but it might also happen in a different way, and to be prepared, to be organized, to be mobilized, and also not to start out feeling defeated that all of this doesn't add up and it doesn't matter. As I was on another webinar last week, and one of the things that had, if you give up on the rule of law and you don't challenge these things in the courts and the streets and elsewhere, then you've in fact ceded that political space, that legal space already.
I'll play off the mention of uncertainty here. If we are on the other side of a tipping point re-immigration, then some pretty significant change is possible, change that we did not think 2 months ago that would be possible is possible. Stuff like severe reforms for ICE from the budget deal in the next 2 weeks might be something to pay attention to, but broadening the scope of possibility beyond that, there's clear public support for even now abolishing ICE as an entity. I don't think that's likely to happen because of Congress, but there is potentiality for significant reform that we might not even really be able to comprehend at this point, if this is a real tipping point. That's sort of the nature of it.
And the last thing I would say is just, again, there's law on the books versus law on the ground, right? I mean, just because the law allows the president to invoke the Insurrection Act doesn't mean he should. Just because the law allows states not to enforce federal law doesn't mean they shouldn't cooperate, right? Just because there is federal supremacy immunity doesn't mean there shouldn't be investigations and that there should be cooperative investigations. So again, it's just my view that it is just not correct to assign blame here or attribute blame here to one side versus another, and that both sides can do things to turn down the temperature a little bit and to cooperate, and just that's what I would be on the lookout for.
Great. Well, Elliott, Ilan, and Marie, and Elora, thank you so much for making the time to participate, and thanks so much to all of our audience for tuning in. And I encourage you to check out the Institute of Global Politics events page for more events like this one on timely issues in the United States and around the world. Thanks again, and have a good morning. Take care.
Thank you.